If you want more money at your job, don't ask for a raise because according to a study from LendingTree, switching jobs was way more profitable. Workers who switched jobs saw their average earnings jump over 11% and in some cases up to 30% or even 38% as reported. With the average pay raise on an annual basis in the United States sitting at 3% while inflation sits between 4 to 5%, that means you are literally losing the purchasing power of your dollars by staying at your job. Switching jobs has many benefits that we're going to get into today, but first we need to understand why we should be switching jobs, and that's because loyalty is not rewarded. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median tenure of a worker in the United States as of last year was 4.1 years, and the number is even lower for younger workers like millennials and Gen Z at 2.8 years. You can contrast this to the baby boomer generation where the job tenure for most of those people was a lot longer. Now, according to a Stanford business professor, one of the reasons why loyalty isn't really rewarded anymore these days is because of the norm of reciprocity. In our personal lives, repaying favors are typically a norm. So let's say someone invites you over for a nice sushi dinner, you probably will invite them over to your house at some point in time. There's a personal moral code that enforces this, and in general, if you do something for somebody else, you generally will benefit later on at some point. But what the Stanford business professor found was that reciprocity doesn't really translate very well in an organizational setting, and he actually found that through 5 different studies. So let's actually listen to what he has to say here.
And so when you get a favor done for you in an organizational setting, you're less likely to attribute that kindness to some trait or disposition of the individual, and more likely to attribute it to the fact, well, they were just doing their job. And that also then diminishes the pressures or the likelihood that you will repay that favor because it's not really a favor, it was just part of their job.
His point here is that loyalty used to mean something, and in the past, perhaps that would have gotten you better pay, a pension, or even better benefits, but these days, loyalty is just the same thing as doing your job. So why should an employer feel the need or be compelled to give you even more compensation for just doing what you should be doing? Another reason why loyalty isn't really rewarded anymore is that these days there are many more workers with a college degree than say back in the 1960s or 1970s. Back then, companies had to incentivize their educated workers to stick around with better benefits and better pay, or else they might just go somewhere else. However, these days, according to this graph right here, you can see that the amount of kids with college and high school degrees have been close to all-time highs. That means that the employer kind of has a little bit of leverage here because there's such a big supply of workers that are educated. So instead of being rewarded for loyalty, an employer might just go find somebody else because you're pretty replaceable, and that's another reason why we might want to consider job hopping. The biggest benefit of switching jobs, I think, is definitely the pay bump that you might experience from doing so. However, another reason is that it provides a hedge for those people that are a little bit too shy or a little bit nervous to ask for a raise. For me personally, I wasn't the type of worker that had my chest puffed out and thought I was a hotshot and go into my boss's office and ask for a raise. I was taught that I was lucky enough to even have a job in the first place, so I was just afraid to lose my job, and therefore I would just never ask for what I wanted. I'm sure many of you are in the same boat as I am or have a similar sentiment, especially if you have immigrant parents. They kind of are just teaching you, hey, you should just be working and be happy with that. But therein lies the issue already. If you aren't willing to go and ask for raises, you're going to be losing ground to those people that are going to be able to ask for those raises on a regular basis. If the employer doesn't automatically give you a raise every single year like clockwork, then technically you also are losing out to inflation as well. An employer will only want to give you what you ask for, and sometimes if the status quo is good enough for the worker, then the employer has no incentive to give you a raise. In my experience, big organizations would rather string you along with the hope or the possibility of a raise or promotion in the next cycle or the next year to keep you working and to keep your wage the same. So that's a benefit of switching. You'll get a clean slate to negotiate your pay, and that just having that opportunity of negotiating your pay could increase your salary by a lot. Some people even report upwards of 20 to 30%. This method is really good for early on in your career when you can switch jobs every 1 to 2 years, and then whenever you make a switch, you make a lateral move in your title, but perhaps you increase your pay, or you make a lateral move in terms of your pay but increase your title. Either way, if one of these two variables is going up at either time that you switch, you're probably gonna see outsized returns later on. In my personal experience, that's a great way to increase your salary by even upwards of 50%, 100%, or even 200%. So when I used to work in video games, my first ever job was a customer support and quality assurance role, and I worked there for $40,000 a year. After being there for about a year, I found another type of role at a different type of gaming company called Live Operations Support, and essentially it was a very similar role but in the monetization space. However, they did state that they liked my quality assurance experience. My starting salary there when I got that live operations role was $75,000 a year, so just simply by me job switching got me an 87.5% increase in my salary. Not to mention, I got tons of new opportunities to grow and expand my skills, and even just after a year of working in that live operations role, I would be getting hit up on LinkedIn all the time from recruiters for other types of roles that were similar to mine, paying $105,000 or $110,000 per year. Had I stayed at that original company that I was at for the next 2 or 3 years, perhaps my salary would have gone up, let's say $5,000 per year. So maybe at the end of 2 or 3 years, I might be making $60,000 or $65,000. That's still a lot of money, but it paled in comparison to the job switch salary that I got. The times that it makes most financial sense to move jobs, according to LendingTree, was, quote, when workers moved to larger companies, they saw the biggest pay increases. Those moving to a company with 500 plus employees saw an average salary increase of 15%, while those moving to smaller companies only saw a 5 to 6% increase. And this kind of makes sense. Larger companies tend to have a bigger budget so that when you do switch jobs, they can probably pay you the fair market rate. Moving to a small company doesn't yield that much of a high increase in your pay because smaller companies just have smaller budgets, and if you're thinking about joining a startup, I just wouldn't expect too much of a pay increase. Now, in a similar vein, if you move to a company that's more mature and a lot older, you'll actually see an average increase in earnings, according to LendingTree, of 13%. They found that applying for companies that have existed or been around for longer than 11 years is where you'd see the largest increases in your pay. Now, no surprise, the companies that have been around for a year or less is where you'd see the least amount of increases in your pay. There were also states and industries that contributed to the highest pay increases. For example, if you moved to or within Ohio, you would actually see your quarterly earnings increase over 33%, and Connecticut and New Jersey are also tied for second at 26%. I'll put up a list of the top 10 states on the screen right now and also link to this study down below in the description so you can check it out after this video, but you can see that in many situations, you'll earn at least 10 to 12% by job switching in many states. In terms of the worst states to job switch within, you want to stay away from Wyoming as well as North Dakota because they actually have negative percent in terms of their wage changes, so you would actually lose money if you switched within Wyoming, and you would stay relatively flat by switching within North Dakota. When it came to industry-specific switches, the study actually found that the mining industry actually accounted for the highest pay change after switching employers, followed by finance and insurance and accommodation and food services. Healthcare was a close fourth in terms of industries, followed by utilities as well as transportation. I've compiled somewhat of a checklist of when you should consider job switching. Now, if you meet any of these criteria, that's when you want to consider job switching for a better quality of life or perhaps better non-pay benefits that you can get. The first is that if you've been at your job and you haven't seen a raise for over 18 months, you should probably consider job switching. Now, this is probably dependent on your role as well as where you are within the company, but I'd say if your wages still aren't keeping up with inflation and it's been quite some time now, that's when you can consider it. So that's the next scenario in which I would actually consider switching jobs, is that if you're only getting raises of, let's say, 2% per year or 3% per year, your purchasing power isn't going anywhere. I'd probably consider switching jobs at this point as well. If you aren't learning anything anymore, your skills have plateaued, or you're not feeling challenged at work, that could be a good opportunity to find a different job, because the more skills that you gain in the long run, you're actually going to get more pay out of those skills, hopefully. And so the idea here is that if you're feeling a little stagnant at work, that might be a good opportunity for you to look for something. If your pay is 20% under the market rate or more, that's probably when you should either go to your employer and ask for a raise so that your pay is matched to your skills, or consider switching jobs. You can check out if your pay is close to the market rate by looking it up on sites like Glassdoor, or you can just ask some of your coworkers perhaps what they're paid in a similar position, or look up other positions in your field. Another reason you might want to consider switching jobs is if your commute is way too long. So I would classify that as anything over 30 minutes, so 30 minutes to an hour each way. So if your commute is, let's say, 1 to 2 hours per day, that's quite a long time. You want to think about how much your time is worth and see if that commute is worth it to you. So let's say, for example, you earn $60,000 a year. That means on roughly an hourly basis, you make around $30 an hour. If you commute to and from work each day for an hour each, that means you're essentially costing yourself $60 of opportunity cost in your time. The trade-off for a commute definitely needs to make sense here. So let's say you lived outside of a city, let's say 30 to 45 minutes away, and therefore you saved a bunch of money and the commute was worth it. It's definitely situation dependent, so you want to run the numbers for yourself, but I would say a big benefit of having a shorter commute is definitely the peace of mind that you get from it. Lastly, if you feel like your upward mobility is capped at your current job, that might be a good time to consider switching. Now, some of you guys will work in an industry where your job is naturally capped no matter what. Like, let's say you're a second grade teacher. Well, if that's the case and you want to earn more money as a teacher, one of the ways that you can do that is perhaps by switching locations. It's not the easiest thing to do, but let's say you live in in Tennessee, you could switch to a higher cost of living area. You might get paid a lot more, but as long as you're getting paid way more than proportionally what you're paying in terms of your cost of living, it might be worth it for you. Now, how often should you switch jobs? I would say this is pretty much up to you, but I would say, in my opinion, anything less than a year might not look that great on your resume. If you're only at a place for, let's say, 6 months every single time you switch jobs, that signals to future employers that, hey, maybe this person is a little bit flaky and is not gonna stay with us longer than 6 months, so we shouldn't invest in them. A year, in my experience, is generally a good amount of time to be at a job, but more importantly, you wanna be making sure that whenever you're making a move for a new role, that it's at least a growth opportunity. It makes way more sense to a future recruiter if you go from, let's say, company A to company B to company C, but you're increasing your title every single time. So you go from product manager to senior product manager to director of product management. That looks good even if you switched jobs every single year, because every single time you switched, you had a good reason to do so, which was, hey, perhaps there was more opportunities and more room for growth. In general, job hopping every 1 to 2 years is pretty great for early on in your career, but the time usually increases as you get a little bit older and get a little bit more experience with your jobs. Navigating this will depend a lot on your own situation. So what do you guys think about job hopping? Would you guys do it? Have you guys already done it? Let me know your experience in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.